Hello and welcome to PGurus. This is Jayanthi. A few years ago, an article in The Economist asked why India, despite being the world's fastest growing economy, had such a dreadful record on sanitation and why it was so hard to fix India's sanitation. Another article in The Hindu asks if Indians are by nature unhygienic. The New York Times blames Hindu texts. Even a paper in the NIH blames Hinduism. In fact, Hinduism is routinely blamed for India's sanitation problems and, for that matter, every other problem. Now, it is true that India has a serious sanitation, water, and waste management problem. There is visible garbage everywhere, water bodies are contaminated, and even the air is polluted. But is Hinduism to blame for this? Colonial and neo-colonial narratives seek to portray Hinduism as a root of all problems. What do Hindu texts say, though? And what do archaeological sites reveal? And what did our ancestors actually do? To help us examine our civilization's approach to water and waste management, we have with us none other than Sahana Singh. Sahana ji is exceptionally well placed to discuss this topic. An environmental engineer by training, Sahana has worked with as the editor of Asian Water magazine for many years, and her articles have been published in news outlets across the world. Sahana ji has also researched the history of water and waste management in India. Sahana ji, welcome.
Thank you very much. Namaste to everyone.
Sahana ji, ancient Indian archaeological sites seem to paint a very different picture that is at odds with the popular narrative. Could you shed some light on this topic and discuss what our civilizational practices were?
So the thing is that it's actually very ironic when anything about sanitation or hygiene is lectured to Indians or to Hindus, because this is something that is so embedded in our culture. The concept of shaucha is so deep rooted in our culture, in our texts, and in our medical texts. It comes again and again as a theme where we understand hygiene and cleanliness not just in terms of external hygiene, but also in terms of internal purity, how the mind itself should be so shuddha, how you should cleanse your mind. And then of course externally it is very well understood. So when time and again when we are accused of being people who don't understand sanitation, it's actually laughable. So a lot of problems that we see with sanitation today has come from colonization. It's colonization, deracination, a disconnection from our past, that and of course the povertification, or whatever you call it, becoming poor, is
Yes.
has also led to a lot of abandoning of hygienic practices. But
Yes.
in our culture, hygiene is very intrinsic. And actually, I
Yes.
have a slideshow. So basically, I wanted to talk about the Indic understanding of hygiene and environmental protection. So we had the concept of shaucha, as I mentioned, and the general hygiene in terms of bathing or washing hands and feet. This was so much a part of our culture, so that when you read the story, you see how the guests' feet are washed by the host. Right. This is the first step you do, washing your feet before you enter the house because you've walked in dust. Then even sexual hygiene. That's so amazing that if you read Kama Sutra, there is a lot of talk about how to be hygienic, even with regard to your sexual organs, before sex, after sex, all that is mentioned. And the understanding of isolating the disease causing pathogens which are in the feces, in the excreta, how that has to be isolated from the places where we live, from human settlements. That understanding also was there. So under no circumstances were human waste, blood, or hazardous substances to be allowed to contaminate water bodies. This understanding was there. So, the main premise of my argument is that hygiene, disease prevention, environmental protection, and the need to recycle nutrients in human waste was deeply understood in our culture. So, we have texts like Sushruta Samhita, Charaka Samhita, Manusmriti, Vayu Purana, Vastu Shastra, Kama Sutra, Artha Shastra. All these texts, they encode principles which could easily have been used to extract global best practices, which we need for healthy ecosystems. But because we got disconnected, so we didn't use all these texts to make a code of practices, right, for living our lives. And so we forgot about it. And today we are being told by the Western world that, these are the codes of practices you should follow for keeping the environment clean, for hygiene, hand washing. Imagine there are people coming to India to teach hand washing. There are groups, non-profit groups, NGOs, which come and do this work. So this is because we are disconnected. And so, we have to be taught this by the outside world. So if I may, I would like to just present some the excerpts from various texts which give an idea about how deep was our understanding, right? So Charaka
Right.
Samhita, this 27.213 says, the river having water polluted with soil and feces, insects, snakes, and rats, and carrying rainwater will aggravate all doshas. Slimy, having insects, impure, full of leaves, moss, and mud, having abnormal color and taste, viscous and foul smelling water is not wholesome. So it's absolutely made clear that water which is dirty is going to aggravate all your doshas, it's going to make you sick. It's there. Look at this Manusmriti, which is reviled for all for things it says against women and things like that. But look at what it says about hygiene, about cleanliness. Let him not throw urine or feces into the water, nor saliva, nor clothes defiled by impure substances, nor any other impurity, nor blood, nor poisonous things. Again, a very good understanding that the waste products produced by our body should not be going into our drinking water. This one again, Manusmriti. Far from his dwelling, let him remove urine and ordure. Ordure is excreta. Far let him remove the water used for washing his feet, and far the remnants of food and the water from his bath. All these are ancient texts.
Yeah.
Mahabharata. This is absolutely wonderful. Where, when Arjuna, after the assault on Abhimanyu, when he takes an oath that he's going to finish off Jayadratha before the end of the day, and he
Mhm.
says, there are worlds attained by those who touch brahmanas, cattle, and fire with their feet, means those who disrespect people of learning or cattle or Agni, and those who release phlegm, excreta, and urine in water. If I do not kill Jayadratha, let those terrible ends be mine. So just see the kind of understanding that, those who do to pollute the rivers, they are basically going to hell. That was the kind of understanding, right? So, and the other remarkable thing is that Manusmriti lists out the things which are impure. So, the thorough understanding of what are the impure substances produced by human bodies, which, if
Mhm.
touched, would require cleaning. So, they have the Manusmriti lists out semen, blood, urine, feces, nasal mucus, earwax, phlegm, tears, sweat. So, these are unclean things. If you touch any of these things, then after that you have to wash your hands thoroughly. You can't touch this and then touch food, or touch these things and touch your face. So that kind of strictures which is there in our books, it tells you how much of understanding we have about hygiene.
We could run through this presentation, but I would love to discuss what kind of practices existed starting with the Sindhu Saraswati civilization, and how we managed waste thousands of years ago,
Right.
and we continue on from there. So I would love to address that, but whenever you'd like to do that.
Okay. So, so basically, we the Sindhu Saraswati civilization actually had a sewerage system. But before that, let's talk about the open defecation. See, there were two kinds of people. There were those who lived in the villages, and they would prefer open defecation. But again, open defecation is seen in a very negative way. They think that it existed in India because people didn't know about sanitation. But on the other hand, it existed because they knew sanitation. So they went out into the fields so that they could avoid contamination of food with fecal matter. Because in those days, there were plenty of places, isolated places far away from habitation, far away from water bodies, where people could go and defecate. And after doing that, it would be absorbed into the soil. They would cover it with some soil and sand, and they would wash their hands with soap. So it would be recycled back into nature. And then the hand which they used to wash themselves, because they would carry a little bit of water with them, with the hand which they used for anal washing, that hand, the left hand, was never used for eating, because even though they washed it thoroughly, they didn't want to use that hand for eating. Okay, that's the reason why they would use the other hand. And of course, in those days, natural soaps were there made of plants, which they would use for thoroughly cleaning their hands. So that's the reason open defecation was preferred. Um, but you see, in those days, what made sense did not make sense later on when the population started going up. It became harder to find sequestered places. So there was no far away from habitation, which was mentioned in the Vedic text. Go far away and do your job. Do your defecation. Do so that you are far away from any habitation and no contamination can happen of food. Right. So,
Right.
as the population increased, there was no way of doing that because every village would be next to the other village. So, if you went far
Right.
off, then you went to the next village. So, open defecation became unsustainable later on. So, that was the time when we should have transitioned into eco-san toilets, the ecologically, sanitized toilets with decentralized sanitation. That's what we should have used, but that didn't happen, and instead we were right into the colonial age when we were given flush toilets, right? So I'll come to the problems with flush toilets.
Right.
So now we come to the urban people of ancient India. So unlike rural dwellers, they had latrine and sewerage because that's what we hear about in Saraswati. We can see them even today. The Indus Saraswati people were the earliest to use latrines, soak pits, cesspools, pipes, and channels for wastewater disposal. And they had different kinds of toilets. Some were just holes in the ground, and others had seats. And they also had pour flush toilets. So you could flush it by pouring, and then they would all be absorbed into the soil or they would be carried away. Uh, there would be a slope which would they would carry it away through pipes, and then they would be collected in pits lined with clay bricks. So that is where they would be collected so that they would be there would be a kind of settling which would happen. So this is the one that you had been asking me, the main
Right.
drain at Lothal, which is an Indus Saraswati site. And you can see this is a drain where, water could be drained off and then ultimately it would settle off and the upper liquid would go and meet the sea or whatever it is, which would be less polluted. And there would also be filters which would filter out the solids. So terracotta pipes, brick lined soak pits, these have been found not just in the Indus Saraswati sites, they've also been found in Takshashila, Delhi, Ujjain, and Arikamedu. So you can see that the urban people had an understanding of toilets and the wastewater disposal. But so we need to do more excavations. So far, we have just done very few sites. So if we do more excavations, we'll find more towns with probably with well-developed wastewater management systems. We already know that Arikamedu in Tamil Nadu, which was a very important center of textile production, it even had industrial wastewater systems. It
Right.
dates to the first century before the Common Era because they were trading with Rome and they were sending exporting a lot of textiles. And when you produce textiles, there'll be dyes that are used, there'll be wastewater. So they even had treatment systems for that.
Yeah, and Kiradi as well. The Kiradi, excavations in Kiradi as well, they have found similar channels for wastewater and industrial wastewater.
Correct, correct. So what has happened is that there is a lot of miscommunication about open defecation, and it might be intentional or it might be ignorance. But the way they have the New York Times and other publications, economists, they have been projecting it is that open defecation has been an issue with India, and this is a direct quote from New York Times, where this person is saying, Gardiner Harris, the journalist says, some ancient Hindu texts advised people to relieve themselves far from home, a practice that Gandhi sought to curb. So it's like, they're being told to pollute, go out and do your dirty business and pollute. That is what the ancient Hindu texts are telling. That's the way it has been projected in these texts, which is the opposite of what was in the text. It was
Yeah.
to protect the habitations that they were being told to go out, right? And go away from all habitation, not to go and pollute. And besides, they were recycling it into the soil.
Soil. Yeah.
Yeah. And you have this movie, Toilet Ek Prem Katha, which is all about bashing Brahmins and making it seem like the Brahmins were the ones who were against toilet building. And you have to fight the Brahmins in order to build toilets, which is a very wrong narrative, right?
Yeah.
And we must understand that these flush toilets, though they are very convenient and they help you to flush away your solids, which you don't want to see. But what happens after you flush is something that not many people know, right? So with
Right.
one press of the flush handle, which uses 10 to 20 liters of clean water, you're able to send out the unwanted waste out of sight and you don't
Right.
bother where it went. But where it goes is to a modern wastewater treatment plant where, they all that water, you use clean water to flush the solids, right? As you know, just a little bit of contaminant can pollute a whole lot of water, and you have used water to clean water to flush out your solids,
Exactly.
and then you're sending it to a treatment plant where that water is being, again, it's being separated from the solids. Now all these processes where there is screening, sedimentation, then there is the bacterial high, there is an activated sludge process, there's an bacteria aided process to break down the solids. All this is being done, and then you have to again remove the water from it, and that water is not clean because it has been in contact with solids, right? So
Right.
all this treatment is done, which is very expensive, uses a lot of energy, lot of chemicals. This is the modern wastewater treatment. And it is not informed by the ecological sanitation, that the understanding of that, which used to be there in ancient times. There's a huge cost of digging underground and installing sewer lines. Large amounts of energy needed to separate solids from water, which I mentioned. Why were they mixed in the first place? So if you see the ancient methods where they were doing open defecation, they were not using water to they were not contaminating water with it, and they were recycling it back, right?
Right.
Now today, cities are struggling to find finance for sewers, for treatment plants, and in the meantime, the sewage, the water mixed with waste, is just going into rivers, into land, and polluting wherever it goes, right? And then we are also not recovering the nutrients. So when
Right.
we excrete, the excreta contains a lot of nutrients, and we are
Right.
not recovering that. Okay, it's just going into the rivers and the seas, and that also was handled by us in ancient times.
Exactly.
So this is the crisis that we have, the sanitation crisis. Large amounts of wastewater, that is used water from homes, commercial establishments, industries and farmlands, they're flowing into rivers, seas and other water bodies without treatment. So fecal sludge and solid waste are finding their way into the food chain because ultimately they come back into our food. The pathogens, the harmful bacteria and the microorganisms which are in our excreta, they are coming back to us. So
Yes.
that causes a serious impact on human health, education, and economy.
Right.
So this is in fact just recently in 2017 also, Virginia in America, they had a major source. They dumped untreated sewage. So it's not that it's happening only in developing countries. Even in developed countries, when there's too much of wastewater which they cannot handle, they just dump it into the water bodies. Okay, so we are losing nutrient. This is something we should understand, that excess nutrients are excreted through our urine. So not everything in the food is absorbed. We don't need all of it. So the excess nutrients are let go through the urine. So urine contains nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And so there are only rare instances of nutrients being recovered for agriculture via modern sewage disposal. So we are all importing fertilizers. We are importing fertilizers, and it is causing a drain on economies. So India imports 90% of phosphate fertilizers. America
Right.
imports about 85% of potash. Right. So instead of mining our excreta and taking whatever nutrients we can from it, we are just letting it go, and then we are mining for all these nutrients that we need, and then making fertilizers and applying it to the plants all over again. So that is why we
Right.
are depleting our phosphate and all those, the nutrients. We're actually depleting it from nature itself as we are mining for them.
Yes.
So to put it simply, humans are going through the elaborate process of mining and processing to manufacture fertilizers, applying them to crops, and then losing it all via wastewater. So lakes and streams which receive an excess of nutrients from wastewater, they are suffering from oxygen depletion. So once you're sending all these nutrients to water bodies, so what happens is it depletes oxygen from there, and the fish die. So it's very bad for the living organisms in these water bodies. And
Right.
another thing is that the synthetic fertilizers that we are manufacturing, they are energy intensive. So even the process of making fertilizers is using up energy, and there's an ever growing population. So we need more and more fertilizers to grow more and more crops. So this is also part of the sanitation crisis. Not many
Right.
people know that. So now I want to tell you about the miasma theory, which is very interesting. It's a very ancient, archaic theory. It is dumped. It is no, doesn't make sense anymore. but this has caused a lot of wrong policies.
Right.
So the miasma theory, now obsolete, of the 19th century, originated somewhere in Europe. It held that diseases like cholera, chlamydia, plague, and other diseases were caused by miasma, which is a kind of bad air. So they said that, you're getting diseases because you have inhaled bad smelling air. That caused the disease. So it's not about, at that time, the germ theory had not yet come. So they thought that the smells are making you sick. So when the flush toilet was invented, it was hailed by people of London and the European world because it removed smells from the housing. Earlier smell,
Right.
it used to be smelly, and so now when you flush it, the smell goes away from your house, and so they don't care where that smell went, where that smell causing waste went.
Right.
So that's how it was. The flush toilets became very popular. And excreta was disliked only for its smell, not for its potential to cause disease. And can you believe it? They were thinking that the more you send your excreta into the Thames River, the better it is for the residents, the less they will fall sick. That was the understanding because of the miasma theory. And it was there right till the almost the 19th or 20th century. Can you believe it?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, actually, it's funny you mentioned that because they didn't understand germs at all, and it is only towards the later part of the 19th century, after Pasteur understood about microorganisms, and then Lister came up with the idea that we need to keep wounds sanitary, because before that, what surgeons did was that they literally moved between living patients and cadavers while they were doing dissections and autopsies. So can you just imagine that, like with decaying corpses, they would move between that and a living patient, and not without any surprise, most people who went in for surgeries died of infections. And it's only after Lister then came up with the idea that, oh well, maybe there's a microbe, maybe we need to keep it, antiseptic. But we find, like some of the texts in with Sushruta, when they're talking about surgery, they talk about cleaning the wound, keeping it hygienic, sterilizing it, applying antiseptic, antimicrobial herbal pastes. Turmeric was, for that reason, considered sacred because of its ability to fight off organisms. So this is a vastly different understanding of hygiene, whereas well into the 19th century, they didn't understand that people can get infected if you touch something that's decaying. So it's quite
Absolutely.
astonishing.
It's astonishing because, it was a shock even for me to learn that the sewer commissioners of London, they were proud that they are sending huge volumes of human waste from the toilets into the river. So there are newspaper reports which say that they have deposited 29,000 cubic yards in the spring of 1848 and 80,000 cubic yards by the winter of 1849. They're saying, look, we have sent so much of waste into the Thames River, and that's going to be good for us. Imagine in 1848, 1849, whereas we in our Manusmriti and all, which are like pre-common era texts, right, at least 3,000, 4,000 years old, and they're emphasizing that you should not be polluting water bodies.
Right.
So the interesting thing is that the Times reports in 1858 that death rates have declined because the Thames has grown fouler. And there was total ignorance about the fact that when the tide in the North Sea will rise, it will bring the filth in the filth in the Thames is going to go back upstream to the intakes
Yeah.
of the drinking water company. So they didn't
Right.
know that. And this is a book by Sonia Shah. It's called Tracking Contagions from Cholera to Ebola and Beyond, published in
Yeah.
2016, which has a lot of useful information. And
Right.
in that she says, nevertheless, under the powerful influence of miasmatism, when cholera struck, Londoners believed it was not because of too many flush toilets dumping human waste into the river, but because too few did. And so, flush toilet sales in the years after the 1832 epidemic enjoyed rapid and remarkable growth. According to an 1857 report, flush toilet sales enjoyed another spike after an 1848 outbreak of cholera. So many Londoners installed flush toilets over the 1850s that the city's water use nearly doubled between 1850 and 56. So, this is very telling that they are depositing more and more waste into the Thames, and they're not realizing that it's leading to cholera outbreaks, right? And
Yes.
ultimately, of course, they realized, and then they started treating the waste. So instead, now they put a treatment plant in between the river and the flush toilet discharging its waste. So now
Yeah.
there's a treatment plant, and now it's all about how to make that treatment technology more efficient. And that same thing is continuing even today. So you can flush anything, you can put anything. Now it's the business of the treatment plant and the engineers to figure out how to separate them from the water. Okay, and
Right.
that usually will never happen because we are putting so many things in our waste. So when we shampoo, when we put creams on our body, other things, they contain a lot of harmful substances. They have endocrine disruptors, they have
Yes.
carcinogens in them, and we put all those things, and then we flush them. We have bath as well. The bathing water also goes in that. And then when it goes to the treatment plant, even in Western countries, I'm telling you, even in Western countries, they're not able to remove everything because you need very,
Yeah.
very expensive membrane technology, which is unaffordable for, for every treatment plant cannot have it. So they
Yeah. And
just remove, sorry,
microplastics too. I mean, it's everywhere.
microplastics. What else? I mean, so many things now. Newer and newer waste products are coming into our wastewater, and then the technologies. Of course, they have technologies, but they can't install it in every treatment plant. That's the challenge because that's
Right.
very, very expensive. So ultimately, they will remove the main things, and the rest of
Yeah.
it just goes into rivers and everything. And that's how it's coming into our food. That water is used for irrigation. That water
Exactly.
ultimately becomes our drinking water. But what I want to say is, what would have happened if Indians had stayed connected with our ancient knowledge? That's a point I want to make. I feel they would have gravitated towards the eco-san or composting toilets, because
Yes.
we already had a tendency to use very less water, and we all knew that we need to isolate our waste. So we would have gone probably towards ecological toilets, and we would have produced fertilizer. We would have probably recycled the waste and got fertilizers out of that, and bioenergy. We would have got bioenergy. So I don't think that with our full connect knowledge of our shastras, I don't think we would have built a system which would send wastewater from toilets to rivers like as sacred as Saraswati or Ganga in ancient India. So that's the tragedy of having been disconnected from our texts. So I want
Yeah.
to make the case that if engineers globally devised a set of best practices out of Vedic strictures, right, then we would be very, very sustainable, and we would be in sync with our culture if we go back and devise a set of best practices.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. And one of the interesting things that we find is that this idea of not polluting our water bodies was so sacred to us, and the water itself was considered sacred. Whereas the idea of you know defecating, when they talk about open defecation, what the critical thing that they don't realize that was in practice before in rural areas, not in urban areas, was that people were going into the soil. It was not just like on the pavement or something. It was into the soil and it was composted. Whereas
Right.
in Europe, they literally went in chamber pots that sat in their rooms. And this practice came into being in India mostly after Islamic invasions, because the idea of defecating within the room and having someone else come and clean it out was kind of alien in early India. So scavenging even was quite common in the rest of the world before, and was probably came in later on, because we either had urban situations where it was flushed out and sent into soap pits, or rural situations where it was literally composted into the soil. So this is something that is rarely discussed, because
Yes, it was
it's
called night soil. Actually, the funny thing is that prior to this whole sewerage system that I just described, there was this night soil collection system. So they had toilets where they would do their job, and then there would be this the European lower caste people who would come in the dead of the night. They were called gong farmers, night soil men, who would come in the dead of the night with carts, and they would go to individual toilets and empty the contents of the pits and put them in the cart, and then they would take them away, and they were not allowed to enter the city during the day. They had to live in the outskirts of the city, And then they would, when they would take back the solids, then they would dry it out, they would turn it into fertilizer and maybe sell it and make some money out of it. But the point is, because they were touching all these things, they were considered as outcasts, right? So that was that was the system that they had. And then this system actually was introduced to us by the Muslims, possibly, because when the Muslim invasions happened, then this is how the women were not allowed to go out into the fields
Yeah.
to defecate. So they had to do it inside the rooms, that in the palace, for example, the royal women. And then the Muslims would often use the prisoners of war to do the cleaning, the
Right.
prisoners of war. And sometimes they would deliberately choose the people of higher varnas, maybe the Brahmins or the Rajputs, to come and do the cleaning, so that then they
Right.
would now be demoted to a lower caste, right? And so
Right.
that they would become outcasts. So they would often make the princes, if they have captured princes, of the people of
Yes.
royal family, the males, they would ask them to do the cleaning. And this is why
Right.
even today you will find certain Rajput, which were originally Rajputs, the jatis, which are today now considered as one of the lower jatis, supposedly. But that's because they were doing this kind of cleaning. And
Yes.
this kind of work was always considered as not a very good profession, even in, I mean, all over the world. So for some reason, they made it seem like it's only in India this kind of thing existed. But
No, it
all over the
exists.
world, there was this. Yeah, that if
Yeah.
you are,
In
these are
Europe,
unclean,
even in
unclean jobs.
Japan, yeah, China, Japan, even today in Haiti, in
Mm,
many parts of the world, it still exists. Of course, in India, it is a problem. It's not that it's not a problem today, but the origins of it are not from our civilization. It's a problem that we've inherited, and it was a problem that we have to do away with
And it's
because it
technology which will solve the problem. So in the Western world, these people who were outcasts were dealing with waste. But once technology came, and then they were able to do it, without touching it, and everything is done without contactless. That is when these people were now, they became mainstream. So it's the same
right,
thing that is going to happen in India as well. Once we ensure that all this waste collection, waste treatment, everything is done without anybody coming in contact with it, no human touches it, then there will be respectability for those professions as well.
right, right. And it is important for us to make sure that we honor the principles that that are so sacred to our dharma, which is keeping our waters clean, keeping like having water as a sacred water body was something that was part of our culture as well. I know you tweeted about Varanasi, the sacred waters of Varanasi, and how it was a land of lakes, literally. And we find that this is true across India. The idea that water should be treated as sacred, and these water bodies worked for rainwater harvesting as catchment areas for flood control. But now they've been drained, and these low-lying areas have been used. They've built over that, encroached over it, and so it's no surprise that you have see these in Chennai as well. It's the same thing. I mean, it was just full of water bodies. But in colonial times as well as post-colonial, even independent India has encroached on these lands, and now we see cycles of flooding and drought. Which are in older times, in the kings had spent significant resources building up an infrastructure where water could be retained and kept clean.
Yes,
So
that's
this
a
is
very, very important observation, that, when we, in ancient times, or even, just right until the 1700s, when there was monarchy, in fact, monarchy was, the good kings used to take very good care of all the rivers and the water bodies. And then, because people was not deracinated yet, they were not colonized yet. So they regarded the rivers as sacred and as part of them. So for example, when a child was born, we hear that, I was hearing from one person who is a Rajput. He was telling me that when he was a young person, whenever the birthdays came along, that would be the time that the tanks would be cleaned. So the
yeah,
water tanks would be cleaned whenever the birthdays came along. So imagine they had that kind of understanding. And then, so the rivers were not polluted. There is no way that they would want to urinate in a river or send anything to the river, right? So this
right,
understanding has to, and once we got away from it, also the other thing is that the government came along and, as you said, started filling up these waters, because in the British times, for some reason, they thought that these people who are taking dips in the water before they go into the temples, that
Yeah.
is causing disease. So when they didn't make the connection between excreta going into water and causing the disease, they thought that it was these demonic practices that these Hindus are following, who are they're dipping, they're going into the water, and then that's how diseases are being spread in the city, and then it used to make the British officers also sick. So they didn't make this connection that it happens only when excreta gets into water. It's not because there is a water body around the temple into which devotees are dipping. That is not the thing causing disease. So they somehow it was a very clever way in which they linked all this Kumbh Mela with diseases, and used that to the missionaries used that to tell people that these are demonic practices, and so you need to convert to Christianity.
Yeah.
And you can actually
No.
see a direct link in places like Meghalaya, where
Yeah.
when they changed their religion, when they got converted to Christianity, they actually stopped taking care of the forests, the sacred groves,
Yeah.
right? All
Yeah.
the rituals that were associated with sacred groves or with water, they stopped doing them. And slowly
Yeah.
that laid the path open for the builders to take over the forest, to cut all the trees and build whatever they wanted.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the recognition of the sacred was so deeply embedded for us, and we considered, land to be sacred, Prithvi, Bhumi Mata, and
Mm.
water to be sacred. And that's why Tirtha and Sthala, which is the sacred
Mm.
water and the sacred, site. It also contained sacred groves, which have all been pretty much, they've been wiped away. The
Mm.
lands, temple lands have been encroached. We've
Right.
lost that connection. The hills were considered as sacred because that's the best way we can honor the biodiversity and protect it. Now,
Correct.
by constantly, mocking the sacred and desacralizing our relationship with the environment, what they've made is a situation where we continuously start to, uh, you know, exploit the environment. That's in Abrahamic, in our called civilization. Even the simplest puja invokes the panchabhutas, which is,
Mm.
Prithvi and Vayu and Agni and Jala and Akash. So that's why we light the deepam, we light the dupam, and we, try to. And when we vitiate the panchabhutas by polluting land, water, and air, then, we're dishonoring the panchabhutas. We throw
Absolutely.
garbage in the streets. I know
Right.
we're this is our punya bhumi, and when we throw garbage in the streets, when the sewage in the rivers, it assaults and dishonors panchabhutas, and that just reveals our disconnection with our dharma. And
I
unless
mean, even
we,
Bangalore was full of lakes. It was a city of thousand lakes, which were all maintained by the king. And slowly, one by one, once they started, the fever of buildings started, they started draining it, because now they wanted roads, they wanted buildings, and this kept on creeping in. And once people are no longer connected with the water, they are not in charge of maintaining the water. The
right,
government took away their rights to do anything, because once the government started draining the water bodies, then basically they are telling the people, you don't have to do anything, just stay away from this. So then the people
right,
stayed away from it. Now the people, and it still continues, we don't care when our water bodies are covered up, or there's a high rise building that comes there, right? Some people will go and protest, but the others will just go along with what's happening. So that's the same
yeah,
thing. One by one, the lakes were covered up, and it's happened in Varanasi. That's the book that you referred to, the Sacred Books of Sacred Waters of Varanasi by Mahesh Gogate. It's an amazing book.
yeah,
I hope people read it, which is a
right,
very good research on what Varanasi was like before the British interfered with the whole topography of the place. So
oh,
it had so many lakes. There were like 280 reservoirs, all of them sacred, and so many temples. Even the Kashi Vishwanath temple had water all around it, so that when the devotees approached it, they would dip themselves and then they would go in it. Thousands of years it was there. There was no disease because of it. But
ex-
somehow, they made this vicious connection between disease and these water bodies, started draining them. And then, of course, when they started building other things, the debris used to clog. There were inlets and outlets in all these temple tanks. They started getting clogged, and then they would become stagnant. Smell would come. And then they would worry that, okay, this smell is going to cause disease, so let's just close it out, close up this pond. And that's how they
Right.
started closing. And then the slopes went awry, because in those days the tanks were designed according to the slope of the land, so that all the rainwater that falls is going to collect in those tanks. And they would collect there. It would prevent flooding. And also on hot days, though, when it became very hot, people could use that water if they wanted. Take the water,
Right.
boil it, whatever they could do it. They could either, I mean, usually they would use wells to drink water from, and surface water was more for, just dipping themselves in it and things like that. But once these were closed up, now they have to think of, the British had to now come up with new ways to what to stop the flooding, right? So build the barriers to prevent the flood water from coming. All that was not needed when they actually were, the water bodies were so designed that they could absorb the flood waters. So this has happened in all the cities in India, because the same set of engineers used to share their knowledge, and they would tell the others that you need to close these, because the stagnant water is not good, causes
Right.
disease. Not understanding what was the traditional practice here, and how did they manage, and was it really stagnant, because these waters were not stagnant. They were flowing out, they were flowing in, and they were the inlets and outlets were kept clean. So they interfered with all that.
Yeah, and it's because we've become disconnected from our, the history of our practices, that we think that we knew nothing and we must simply blindly ape the West, and
Hmm.
that these ideas are not integral to our own civilization. We don't recognize that, and that's something we absolutely, if we want to reclaim our civilization, this is the first place we must start.
Absolutely, but it's difficult, because you see, now it's all built up. So today in Bangalore, all those 1,000 lakes which were connected, and which were ensuring that water was conserved. Now, when they have those lakes are gone, so each time they need more water as the population increases, they get water from far off places. They get it from Kaveri, and so they have to build a pipeline. Water has to come from there, and so much of energy has to be used to bring water from far off places, because they covered up all those water bodies which people themselves were maintaining.
Right, right. And they
Mm.
were maintaining it themselves, exactly. There was a
Mm.
lot of maintenance of water bodies that was done by the people. They took that
Mm.
responsibility, not the disconnect that we see
Yes,
now.
because the king
Yeah,
would allocate the resources to them to do this work. So he would give them this job. So it's the king who is supervising at the top, and the people who are feeling responsible and connected, because it was sacred water for them. So once you
yeah,
break the sacredness, you break the whole cycle of the whole virtuous cycle is broken. So
yes,
I made this call for sacredness to come back. Once we start revering our rivers, our land, our crops, the way we were always doing, then we'll
yes,
automatically make designs which are in sync with that, right? So
yes,
so now it's more of a repair work that we're doing, which is going to be hard, but still not impossible. But one thing,
yeah,
definitely, the new places that we are developing, new cities that are coming up, definitely we can get it right there, to think of
yeah,
what kind of water supply, what kind of sanitation. We can try to do it right there. And in the meantime, change the mindset of the people. Try to
yeah,
bring back the
absolutely.
sacred. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, Sahana ji. Your whole talk was so illuminating, and I loved what you said about bringing back the sacred, because I really think that that is where we need to start. And finally, I just want to say that there is a lot we can do. As Hindus today, we have the opportunity to change our trajectory. We must prioritize the cleanup of our rivers, our cities, our neighborhoods. We must not cede the environmental space. Prakriti
Mhm.
and Bhuma Devi are sacred to Hindus, and we must bring back the sacredness, Lexa. And our sacred land and water are being vitiated. And if we treat our Punya Bhumi as as a garbage heap, is it a surprise that adharma and asuric forces will rise, and as we disrespect our sacred mothers, Bhumi Mata and Ganga Ma? They say
Mhm.
Lakshmi does not reside where garbage is present. So
Okay.
I just want to say we diminish our dharma by ignoring our fundamental interconnection with nature. And
Mm.
it is critical that we revive our sacred relationship with the environment and work to clean, to protect, to preserve this environment. And we can do that by reconnecting with our civilizational heritage, recognizing the wisdom of our ancestors, and taking pride in our civilization. In other words, we need to understand and live our dharma. And thank you so much, Sahanaji, for helping us begin this journey of reconnection. Thank you so much. I really
Thank you
appreciate your
so much.
time.
Thanks for inviting me.